I'm Juhi. I'm with the Alliance. I'm the executive director of the Alliance here, who's hosting this event. And for those who are not familiar with our work, the Alliance is a coalition of community-based organizations and advocacy groups building shared power to advance strategic campaigns around the intersections of racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and health equity. And our mission is to advance justice and equity in economic growth and development here in the Twin Cities region. So for many years, the Actualizing Equity series has continued to create a space for community organizers and aligned stakeholders to build relationships, share power, yes, share knowledge, and strategize together in our work to change the policies and systems that influence racial, economic, environmental, and health equity in the Twin Cities region. And so today, we are focused on community and equitable development. So just want to give a little intro to some of the work that the alliances have been part of that we will touch on today, which is that a number of years ago, the Alliance worked with community partners experiencing developmental pressures of displacement and gentrification to create the Equitable Development Principles and Scorecard to help communities ensure that the principles and practices of equitable development, environmental justice, and affordability are available to all residents, particularly those who live there if they are low wealth communities, otherwise just really focused on communities that have been most systemically and historically left out of development and ownership of what happens to their neighborhoods. And so at the core of the scorecard, the tool provides a starting point for communities to ask and answer the critical question of who benefits from new development or redevelopment in our neighborhoods. So again, for generations, development has too often benefited private interests focused on profit rather than the actual community members invested in the collective well-being of any specific place. But across the region, the scorecard has also started to shift power by serving as a catalyst to organize Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and transfer and keep the ownership of the future of the neighborhoods to those who live there and ensure regenerative outcomes that strengthen the community and create an actionable process to engage with developers and stakeholders. And so the scorecard, though has never been really intended to be a checklist or a set of guidelines. We always say it's best to be adapted by those communities that a project is impacting. It is a living document that relies on energy and ingenuity of the unique communities that use it to shape the outcomes that meet their visions. And in recent months, the Alliance has also worked with a number of community leaders and partners to add new principles to the scorecard, a new principle to the scorecard of equitable livability. And we'll hear much more about that today as we dive into the discussion with the organizers and government allies who are using the tool. And I'm sure many of you are also users, and so excited to have you here as a part of the discussion as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Kai Andersen, our wonderful Krusell fellow from the Humphrey, who has been working with us.
I just want to say good morning. Thank you, Juhi. I'm grateful for the ancestors to be here today. And as we do a group grounding together, I just want to take a moment to not only say that you're all welcome, but to just take a breath and to drop into your bodies and your brilliance, not just your intelligence, but just your, what livability might mean for you and how you feel as we journey through this wonderful Actualizing Equity event. So today, we're going to be talking a lot about livability, and we know that the word and concept brings up different feelings. It can be very problematic, and the experiences that we have. As we move into this conversation, we want to invite everyone to take a moment to reflect on what does livability mean? What does it bring up for you? For instance, if you're a white person, what does it feel like to be at George Floyd Square? If you're a BIPOC person, a Black Indigenous person of color, how does it feel for you when you travel down 50th in France or utilize the services? What is that like for you? So feel free to just drop what the words livability mean to you in the chat. And Carolyn, at the end of this part, will lift up what's been heard. But first, I can reflect a little bit, and then also Sister Princess Haley will also give some reflections. For me, I feel emotionally confused, to be personally honest, about livability. I feel that my survival tactics start to take, it feels like a fight or flight psychological feeling, because it doesn't feel like historically the term has really represented who I am as a Black mixed Scandinavian person. And I feel that it's constantly white centered. And so it's something that needs to be more explicitly addressed to BIPOC from a BIPOC perspective. Princess, I'm assuming that you could relate with that. Do you have some reflection?
I can, and thank you for sharing that. It offered a new truth to me as well. You have to get permission sometimes to feel those feelings because you want to keep it all together. But I do, from an experience of coming to Minnesota 27 years ago from Chicago, being very segregated and meeting with people from all different hues and colors who wanted to build communities, so to speak. Um, then when I looked for housing in St. Paul, I was told that coming from Chicago, I could not, nobody would rent to me in St. Paul. So I needed to live in North Minneapolis. And so when I think about what livability means on an individual level, as I come together with my peers socially to try to impact systems change, it's often restrictive. Like the definition does not apply to everyone. Thank you for listening. And I'll return it back over to you, Kai.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for helping to put this on. Do you have some voices you'd like to lift up out of the chat?
Yeah, seeing some folks also kind of having that complicated relationship with livability, that it bringing up grief. And I think that, we'll get into that in terms of livability being somewhat synonymous to potentially displacement or exclusion for some communities. Someone else is saying that, St. Paul calls itself the most livable city. And I think that some of us who do organizing in St. Paul use that to our advantage of if that's your aspiration, that's not the reality right now. And how do we move towards that if that's actually what we want to be as a city? And then also on a more positive note, livability meaning a space to live holistically and thinking about, all the things I think that you need to have to thrive rather than just, survive and keep a roof over your head. So yeah, I will pass it back to you, Kai.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We're going to begin more of content grounding when it comes to the term livability. Over the past year, the Alliance has been working with community members and leaders to create a new principle for the Equitable Development Scorecard livability. And so we want to kind of start by just thinking about why livability? Like, why is it important for livability to live within the scorecard, but also just in our lives? So let's just think about this question a moment. And I would like to share a bit about how I approach the question. Equitable livability to me is about feeling like we can be our full selves in our neighborhoods and the feeling like we belong. It allows us to move away from survival, fight or flight responses and necessary survival tactics. So why livability? Livability historically especially like when we look at smart growth models, have been used in urban planning and design models from a white-centered approach, and ultimately outcomes are profit-driven. Assuming such models work for all actually results in improving walking accessibility or, enhancing green spaces set for affluent white residents. The models are not conducive to improving the well-being that speaks to Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities who are currently and historically excluded, the inequities and the marginalization. So there needs to be this like reframing of livability that explicitly challenges white supremacy. So feel free to take a look at this document as we get us going here. We won't be able to share like every single bullet point, but I'm just kind of giving you the spirit of it. As we look at repairing past harms done by racist policies, and inequitable development and intentional exclusion. So basically, livability has harmed our communities because the principle lacks real justice. So often livability isn't coming from a place of restoration and transformative healing qualities. So when we feel like we belong in our neighborhoods, then we can awaken our ancestral wisdom. And this is, I would say, my personal experience. We recognize qualities within our cultural lineages that exist within us already. We can bring these qualities out more as we feel at home. Just imagine feeling our bellies relaxed, chest softening, and the mind at peace. And so the term livability historically is weaponized to keep Black and brown people out of spaces. So more further into this document, I would just say that we want to get into the question of how. So how do we practice equitable livability? Equitable livability is a new section of the Equitable Development and Principles Scorecard. It is a living document put together by an amazing BIPOC-led livability work group who volunteered their time, poured their hearts into, and genuinely felt through the importance of this equity tool. And so I just want to give a big thank you to this group for this powerful experience. In terms of this criteria language, our focus is to hold investments in development projects accountable to the community vision led by directly impacted and marginalized Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I also want to lift up the intersectional identities when we look at a given project. In the process, we took quality time to feel through what equitable livability means in our bodies personally as a healing experience, and then to take a look at the most fundamental components needed to bring equitable livability to life. So after months of brainstorming, the group grew into a phase of operationalizing the livability criteria language, as you see here in 10 beautiful points, making explicit, measurable, feasible, and practical statements used as metrics to score investment and development projects. So before we get into talking with our panelists, I just want to say that as you look at this, you really see the dignified understanding of three fundamental areas, and that is history, our historical legacy, cultural lineages, and our environmental assets, well-being, safety, and security, and community care, as opposed to systems of surveillance. Healing from past harms resulting from, as many of you know, redlining, racist urban planning policies, extraction, exploitation, and displacement. In order to, 3, build community power towards self-determination in the spirit of collective ownership, authorship, and leadership. So putting together equitable livability criteria language challenged us to think critically about what a successful project would look like if it truly reflects reparative design. So our group asked each other, what is reparative design? How it would reallocate resources to marginalized BIPOC folks, and at the same time, support the healing transformative qualities needed to provide real long-term relationships that are regenerative and build intergenerational wealth. And so I would like to now, thank you for sharing the screen, Carolyn. Great job with this. And Now, I would like to get into the panel discussion. All the panelists introduce themselves when they answer the first question, okay? So each person will introduce themselves and who they represent, however they would like to. So first off, the first question, as we heard in the grounding, the concept of livability has been weaponized against marginalized communities, which is why the livability principle needs reframing. The concept to center the ability of immigrants, communities of color, and other marginalized groups to live, thrive in the places they call home, to use development as a means to move towards networks of community care and regenerative economies and environments rather than displacement and private profit. So the question is, why is this important to your work? What resonates and what is missing? So I'll open up the floor to the panelists. Thank you for listening. Oh, we could start with Yordi too, if that would help.
Okay, way to put me on the spot. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Yordi. I also go by Jordanos, but most people know me by Yordi in community. I'm a community organizer, mostly organizing around environmental justice and just safety in general, I like to say. So policing, surveillance in immigrant communities and just diaspora communities in general. That's a good question, but it's also a very hard question. I think simply put, development is a tool that can look different by the person or the entity in power. I feel like we have a tendency to complicate what development is. It's a pretty simple concept. I work in EJ, environmental justice, where livability is like the central point. So the question of like, can people work, live, and play in this environment or not? That is the only question. And so generally and historically, BIPOC communities have existed and continue to exist in pods, meaning they live in proximity. And so, you know, obviously there's like cultural similarities, value system similarities. Obviously there's differences within that too. But generally, I think mobilizing is harder when communities and neighborhoods are scattered and disrupted. And that's what bad development does. And that's what happens all over the city. And there's places where developers have taken like very clear intentionality when they are developing, they are involving community from the beginning, not as an afterthought. And so I always am a person who thinks about like power specifically. I think it's good to be cognizant of power. A mentor of mine used to say like, power is if you have the power to veto or revert a decision, then you have the power at that table. If not, then you don't have a power. A lot of the time when developers bring communities to the table, they're just wanting like co-signing or some sort of like, hey, can you just say like, this is a pretty great project, and then we can move on and we can say we did community engagement. That is not true power. That is a very unbalanced like power dynamic. There's also like this like false narrative around how developers can bring community care and like deepen community care. Community care already exists in communities. The question is, are you disrupting the fiber of the community care or the neighborhood culture, or are you contributing whether through resources or other means? And I feel like that's the only thing that like developers should be asked. And I think the scorecard does a really good job of making that tangible. So community decision making, again, a lot of the time happens in a very bad way because developers involve agents of white supremacy, even people from the community that are agents of white supremacy saying like, yeah, we did involve folks. So within my work, I see this a lot specifically with like big projects, and a lot of the time, like even in like smaller stuff like food justice work that's like, there's like a lot of land back conversations that are happening right now. The people that are at the table are people that are just there to co-sign. They're not well resourced. They are not the thought leaders. And so if those things are absent, you are weaponizing the conversation of livability. You are not doing it right. So like you almost have to go back to the drawing board and start over. So I'm gonna stop there. I'll pass it to whoever wants to take it.
I think you answered. I'm Princess Haley, one of the co-founders of Appetite for Change, as well as one of the founding members on the EJCC. I formerly sat with the Upper Harbor Terminal Committee to look at this development and make sure that community was involved. And as an individual, I'm not representing any organization today because I want to be able to say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But as an individual, I stepped down from that opportunity because of what Yordi was talking about. For me to have issues and still face issues, like Kai was saying, when I go past these certain areas, I was actually looking for housing at that time. And I was 6 to 9, you know, the mayoral appointee with the Upper Harbor Terminal and looking for housing and knowing that we wouldn't talk about housing on the development of the river for young people or for elders or for people who are in that middle range income level where they don't, you know, qualify for any public assistance, but they don't make enough money. Like somebody said in the chat, you know, the cost of living being so high in certain areas, to not focus on that. And sometimes it seems that when you come with the community ideas, that people are just bringing you to the table to get your buy-in and to see who's at the table, who they can get, who they can buy in. You know, if I offer you an opportunity to open, you know, your restaurant in this business, then it supports that business, that entity, but it doesn't support you as an individual. It's always been the feeling that people aren't important when we start these developments. It's always about more about money. And so I stepped down after the uprising and the continued loss of life, the tipping point, the murder of George Floyd, because I felt like our focus should not be developing on the river when we just attempted to start the cleanup on the river with removing northern metals and still having a lot of emissions come from GAF. And so I stepped down because I felt like at least let's talk about these other issues that are happening. Like, how can it's bad enough I can focus on development and housing when I don't have housing. And now you're expecting me to focus on development and just move right along when everybody's hurting and everybody's traumatized that I'm coming in contact with. And some of my allies are even saying this sits different. When is enough enough? And that conversation that I had wasn't even addressed. And so I knew that it was the right thing to not utilize my time and space in that way. But if you have created a tool such as the Livability Scorecard, how do we get that adapted? How do we get that to be something that the city and state officials have to expect developers to use before they start these developments? You already said it. Like they get ready to develop and then they got the plans and they're like, oh yeah, the community. Okay, let's go get some people from the community to see if they like this. We're still doing it. And we're probably going to do it the way we want to do it. Maybe you'll get your voice heard, but I believe to truly activate the equity, that the scorecard should be used and that people should be the focus. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I guess I can go next. My name is Monica Bravo, and I'm with the Westside Community Organization, and we're in St. Paul. We're the only actual St. Paul community that's on this side of the river, so we're a little bit isolated from the rest of the city of St. Paul. You have to cross the bridges to get to us. And we're also a community organization and a planning council. And so when I think about we have a scorecard. We embarked on the journey of the scorecard in our community, and starting in 2017, completed our final scorecard after a season of community input and listening. Took us a few years, especially as we had community members fully invested in this process. And so now the City of St. Paul Planning Commission has adopted our scorecard for our area. We have some case studies online, and we've met with developers as early as, and also with city planning as early as forming the language around the RFP and RFQ proposals to put even out to developers. And we've also had instances where we've had to come in afterwards and say, hey, hold up, what's going on here? That was when the scorecard was still being created. And today we have a team, it's a community team where there's 2 representatives from each precinct that sit on this team, and they pre-meet with planners and developers with our scorecard. So already, we're at the stage where we need to revise it. And we've had some lessons learned throughout the use of that. But one thing that I would say is, when it comes down to the terminology livability, really, we all know this, right? Like, well, my assumption is that we all know that when it comes to development, it is really about power and money, and who has it, who doesn't, and who keeps it, and who can have access to building that wealth, the power, and the money. So for me, livability is really exactly what we say it is, right? It's like the ability to live, the conditions that we create or can co-create so that family and individuals can thrive in our own neighborhoods. And so what does that actually mean? Like, that means all of the things that we're talking about, life-affirming public safety, life-affirming community safety. It means the prevention of erasure of those cultures and of the immigrant communities that were here and founded some of these neighborhoods, right? It means that taking away the environmental injustices, protecting the land that we have and for years to come. So when I think about that livability component, it's very different than I think sometimes we think about bike lanes, or we think about different ways that it's been used, green spaces. Really, actually what it's about is it's about our ability to actually live and thrive as individuals and families, free from harm. So that's what I'll say right now for the livability component.
Okay, I can go next. My name is Hannah Gary. I work at the Metropolitan Council with the Livable Communities Act program. I manage the Livable Communities demonstration account, which is one of 4 programs within the Act. And when I think about livability, a lot of what comes up has already been said, again, about this idea of being able to really live in a place and not just simply exist or survive. And I think a lot about choice too, and having the choice of where you live and how you live and how you move around. And that's something that is not accessible to everyone. And specifically with my work at the council, livability is in the name of the Act. It's in the name of the program that I manage, which is something that I think a lot of us feel conflicted about. And as we've said, this term livability is often weaponized to exclude marginalized populations. And I think it's really important to infuse these equitable development principles and the principles that are laid out in this, in the livability criteria, into the idea of livability as we use the term in planners, so that we're not continuing to perpetuate the same patterns under a different name. The idea of like bike lanes and green space has come up. And a lot of times this idea of livability and enhancing livability is used to be able to push communities of color out of their homes, out of the places that they have lived for a long time, have deep connections to, because it's making a place more livable. And in thinking about like how we do this with our work within the Livable Communities program, we're talking a lot about human impact. I'm coming to this from a planner's perspective. A lot of planners really like data. We're very focused on like the number of jobs we create, the number of housing units that we create, but we really need to dig deeper into what that means. And if we're putting housing somewhere, what does that really mean for people? What is the experience like for people who are living in those housing units that are created or accessing transit? Do they feel safe? Is it a place that they can build community connections? Is it a place that their children are going to a school that's a good fit for them? So these are all things that we need to be thinking about when we talk about livability, so that, again, we're not continuing to just keep these white supremacist ideals that have been in planning since its inception in place, and just continuing to change the name of those ideals.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Rybaturez. I work with Hannah at the Metropolitan Council, but I'm in the Community Development Research Department. So I appreciate that segue and mention of data, Hannah, because I think for me, when I think about this conversation around livability, you know, my role in charge at the council is to like create data and resources to sort of inform conversations around development and around patterns and trends that we see in the region. And I think about how often what we're talking about today is nowhere to be found in so many of the data that we use in these conversations, right? And so that the focus is on the number of units and the, you know, the jobs, to Hannah's point earlier. And we're really missing a key, like many key pieces of the lived experience and the intergenerational impacts of how one concept of livability and its impact in the region and in our neighborhoods. And so, you know, we've tried at the council to compile some new information, a data set called Equity Considerations that tries to kind of pull in environmental justice information, housing information, change over time, some very parsed demographics. So we're trying to use the resources that we have to advance and try to get folks to dig a bit deeper, to get a little cross-disciplinary so that they can not just look at housing in a silo or transportation in a silo, but have other information at their fingertips to intersect these things and to be more exploratory and holistic in their thinking around development. But I know, and you all know, that we're never going to be able to populate, you know, a database that captures that feeling of whether or not someone feels welcomed or included in their community. You know, how is it going, you know, who is holding that power? And so, you know, there are limitations, and we are starting to lead with those limitations much more often to draw attention to that. So I really feel what's missing from the sort of government research side of things are really those lived experiences and looking at that very intentionally as far as bringing parity, weighing those things equally, not just as like a footnote or an overlay, but really making sure that that's part and parcel of the conversation, as well as those intergenerational impacts too. Difficult to measure, but extremely important. And I'm glad to say that we've been able to start pulling in some of the historic information regarding redline and racially restricted covenants so that it's at the ready, at the fingertips, and we can start trying to bring that historical context forward and make sure that it is a living, active part of the conversation toward that remedy and repair strategy that comes with livability. I'll just say briefly that I also am a West Sider. I also sit on Wesco's Scorecard team. And so I'm going to just switch hats for a second and just echo something that Monica said with regard to, you know, the scorecard in practice and using it to assess projects and these conversations that we have with developers. I think there's like a very important shift that needs to happen in developers reimagining their role and their responsibility to communities. I think sometimes when we've brought forward some of the concepts I see in this livability principle, they kind of shrug and are like, well, it's outside the scope of what I can bring or what I can do. They like to kind of defer or sort of slip past the accountability piece of what they can do. And so do our, city partners as well. Everyone's really just quick to define their lane and what's outside of it. And so then it becomes no one's responsibility. And so I think that there is this deep transformation taking place underway. And the scorecard's a great tool for furthering that. But we need to keep pushing for that transformation and for that power shift to really realize the livability principle as it was shown here today. Thanks.
Kristen, thank you. And thank you everyone for your gifts, your talents, and your voices. We have a second question, and I was really thinking about how important base building is, learning about that, especially from Wesco. We know that the tool like the scorecard is only as good as the community power behind it, right? So without intentionality, tools like the scorecard can feel more relevant to advocates, institutions, rather than frontline organizers and communities. So the question is for our panelists, how are you thinking about accessibility? What are some of the ways that we can ensure the scorecard is meaningful to the communities most impacted by the pressures of development and displacement?
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to kick it off, but I will. So for us, right, like everybody is pretty familiar with this quote, nothing for us without a nothing. See how does nothing for us without us is about us, right? And so really just taking that at its depth for what it means. And so we started off with an Action Equity series, which was really just a way to share with our community what we're thinking about as development came in. And most district councils have a planning table that has to, one of their charges with the city is to actually review development as it comes and then respond, which is pretty reactionary. And so we wanted to be proactive in that. And so the scorecard was really a way and the opportunity for us to get proactive with that development as it comes into the neighborhood and really center the question of who benefits when development comes and who's centered there. And so with that, we partnered with the University of Minnesota and the Cura Institute to host a community series of Action and Equity. And so really it was educational, some pop ed, but more educational forums, right? And so we did that for 3 weeks or 3 weekends on a Saturday morning in the fall, close to over 100 people, sometimes close to 200 people, community members coming out on Saturday mornings, spend their time with us to dive deep into understanding how we're situated uniquely in the city, understanding like how our neighborhood became the neighborhood that it is and like where we sit in the pathway for gentrification. And so, people, it resonated. And so then we began to, through that education process, right? And then it takes time. It takes time to build those relationships, to have a shared analysis, to have a shared understanding, and to move down a shared pathway together. And that's not something that we can do immediately. And so once we went through that series, we started to work with community members on different segments. So who's going to do outreach? What does that outreach look like? How long is the outreach going to take? How are we going to pull stakeholder tables together of our businesses, of our anchor institutions here in our neighborhood? How do we vet this with developers themselves? How do we ensure that we have all the voices at the table as possible, right? And what does this mean for us, further down the road? So we have yet to translate this into a couple of languages. We have yet to we're talking about now, like, what's that bus stop user-friendly version that somebody can sit down and pick it up and be like, oh yeah, I know what this is, right? So there's still much work to be done, but the work that we started with was, let's all get on the same page. Let's get the West, and for us, we're a small, tight-knit neighborhood, so in some ways, it's a blessing that we actually are segregated from the rest of the city, because we can pull ourselves together like that. But in other ways, right, it's a detriment to be segregated from the rest of the city. But it really was this deep dive into community. And then we were everywhere. We were in the parks. We had an organizing team. We had a team that did just outreach. We had a team that did just like the writing of the scorecard, and like transcribing all of the priorities that we shopped around the neighborhood to see if that resonated, and what were the things coming up for community and the different stakeholders. So it takes time. And even now, to this day, I feel like, did we miss it? Did we rush in certain areas? Because there's always these lessons that we're learning along the way. So it takes time.
If I can just add on to what you said, Monica, as a scorecard team member, I wish we could do that Action to Equity series every week, basically, and just keep that refreshed and top of mind for folks coming into the work. We have, sometimes new faces, and, this piece about accessibility, we are asking community to understand sort of three perspectives. Well, first, to bring their own and honor their own areas of expertise and lived experience. We're also asking them to understand sort of like, what our city stakeholders, planners, elected officials, and so forth, like, what are their goals, priorities? How do they use the terms and sort of have their priorities and their plans, right? And how does that intersect with the needs and future of our community? And then developers, how do developers use the scorecard, interpret the language and the criteria in the scorecard? And, so there's a lot of translation that is happening in the work of using the scorecard and applying it to projects. And sometimes, it clicks and works really well. And other times we get really stuck on, why do our conversations seem to be doing this? And chances are it's because there's been some part of that translation process, as much as the scorecard sort of tries to communicate a vision with each and every word, like livability, it's not always perceived or infused with equity and with racial equity and with justice and regenerative systems and all of those things as much as it could be, or rather the shared understanding of that is not widespread in these different pockets of folks that are coming together with the scorecard. And so, that can certainly add a challenge. We have had developers come in and talk about their projects as healing the community and really just going there and co-opting some of the language and concepts that are there in the scorecard. And it's extremely frustrating. And of course, community's right there to be like, nope, just nope on that. But then we have to start from square one and have the conversation over again about, well, what do you mean? Well, what do we mean? And really get to that shared analysis and perspective. And so it's constant. It's not like, a base that we built and that sustains. It almost feels like it's just as, like you said, it takes time. It takes a lot of effort to keep everyone on the same page, even with a written tool, with all that community input like the scorecard. It's very active and living and breathing. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Hi, this is Princess. Thank you for that. Kristen, both of you mentioned the things that I was going to talk about. When I think about accessibility, I think about language often being something that, can be oppressive in a certain way. And so having access to the information, like you said, the developers having it and translating what the community needs to the developers, and from the developers to the community, that language piece is also a barrier. It reminds me of like food access. Like, we want people to have access to food. But then people also have to have the knowledge of like how to create a nutritious meal to feed their family. So when I think about accessibility, I think about it fully being access to the information and then the knowledge of like what that means. And the piece that I look for is like, if developers don't do this, then what? Because people usually don't follow rules unless there's a consequence. Like, yes, the community, we put in this great work. Judy and your team you've done so much to like make sure the community is involved and to create this scorecard that definitely is a communication tool from, the community to developers and vice versa. But if they don't, then what? So I'm often thinking about what's the consequence? Because so I want to see, like I said, I want to see it put into law, because then you know that you have to do this as a developer, or you're fined, or your project can't go on, because that accountability and responsibility piece to me is the part that accessibility doesn't get to. But if you have the information, you have the language, and you have the knowledge of how this is supposed to be used, then what happens if it's not used? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Yuri. Princess, sorry. If I could just comment on that too. That's where I think, Kai, your original question came in, is without a base of people, there is no power for this to actually have accountability. We're learning that accountability measures at the levels of our local governance really are hard to find. And so if there is no accountability mechanism in place, then you're right. Like, where does that account? It comes from the people, right? So then, short of mobilizing and organizing towards direct action, which we have done, we've had to do, like, pull together coalition partners and actually have direct action, put pressure on the city, show up in mass at the council, show up in mass with the developers, actually, go to court. We have had to really activate the base on some of these developments, and it's that accountability component. But without the people, without a base, you're not going to get far. And I think that goes back to what Kai. That's why it's so important to have that invested base. And I too really would love to see those mechanisms, as you said, in the halls of power, so that the accountability can happen. Rather, I think, and I'll just say this, I think oftentimes we're operating out of fear at a level where we need some boldness in our governance.
I think everyone has covered a lot of the basis. So I'm gonna go at this like a little bit different, and from someone who organizes on the ground, and someone who thinks about this very much on the daily basis, and I don't have a solution for it. So in terms of accessibility, I think there's different buckets that everyone mentioned. So one of them is language. The language of the scorecard I think is important, but I feel like that's also foundational. Another thing is just in this room, who's attending this meeting? So accessibility starts there for me. Deinstitutionalizing the scorecard is something that I think about a lot. I think it's a very effective tool if it's streamlined to community. So accessibility comes to when is this meeting happening? And then also what are the resources for this meeting to happen for folks, so that people are here to be in conversation and have a decision making that not only furthers the equity goals of the organization, but actually is impacting Black and Brown communities that are actually on the daily basis being displaced from their homes. So people are not really thinking about this well, in the systems, the way that this works, it's really hard to think about that in every day when you're actually being when a Wendy is built next door in a neighborhood that you've lived in for 30 years. It's really hard to intellectualize it, I guess. yeah, so that is one thing that I'm having a difficulty with. And I think we have talked about deinstitutionalizing the scorecard. And I don't know who said it at our prep meeting, if we could leave the scorecard in a bus. And maybe it was Caroline, and someone could pick it up and look at this. Oh, this could be a tool that I can use in community. I feel like that's like a really good way to assess accessibility, if something is accessible and usable. Resourcing, as someone who, for the longest time, I have to like almost like negotiate my worth and like my labor. I have to think about like, okay, if I'm present as a BIPOC person in the space talking about like these big conversations, how am I being resourced, and what parts of it are being labor, and what parts of it can I just like sit out? But that's really hard to do just by being present. Another thing is like this like myth of expertise, and thinking that like the scorecard is obviously like nobody thinks that here, but like there is this tendency when we create a toolkit, it's going to be like saving everything around equity. And obviously that it's just going to be an ammunition, like an ammunition, like what is it called? Like basically something that you can use for, as a community, like you have a toolkit that could be usable in addition to everything else you have in your arsenal. Like what else? I think another thing I'm thinking about is like, we come in a lot of, I've done this when I used to work with a nonprofit that I still have a really good relationship with. Some of the work that we were doing was really, really impactful. And other times there was like harm, unexpectedly we were doing harm. So when we came into the community, we had our own project that we were doing with the folks that were paying us. So when we came into the community was like, who are you? What's happening here? So like we had to find a way to align with community's priorities. So one thing that I would love to see in terms of accessibility for the scorecard is aligning with community's goals, because livability is such a big thing. It could fit in so many places of community priority. So just like instead of like fitting community's priorities within us, like the other way, and just having like a more like generative space that allows for community's goals being met at the same time that the scorecard is being helpful in some way as a tool, rather than just moving it forward with not a lot of like time or maybe passive engagement is I think the word. So I think as Monica mentioned, in engagement and outreach, time is so precious, but it's also important, especially if you don't have a relationship with the community and they don't know what the hell the scorecard is. It's really, really hard to build relationship and trust and to let them know this is a resource that you could possibly use. So I think just like it kind of is a more foundational thing. So resourcing, and then also thinking about like, how does this outreach and active engagement look like? And what does the decision making and power built by the community look like at the end of this? And if it helps the community meet their own goals at the time of the priority, then I think that is that. But I think just like, yeah, I'm gonna stop there and pass it to someone else.
These have all been really great insights into how to make the scorecard more accessible. And I can just offer a couple of points from the government side on how the government, how government staff can be supportive in making the scorecard more accessible. And the first thing that comes to mind with this is city staff really have the role and I think the responsibility of bringing together developer and community groups together to have a conversation around what outcomes look like going through the components that are in the scorecard, especially with this livability piece. Like, what does livability look like in the community where a proposed project is going? What does equitable development look like for the community that's being most impacted by this project? And developers have to go through the city to, at the very least, get building permits. Like, there's going to be an interaction with the city. And I think this is a place where the city can start to integrate principles that are in the scorecard into the way that cities do their work. We've talked about deinstitutionalizing the scorecard. And I think going beyond that, we really need to change the way that the institutions are doing their work that leads to development. A lot of times this work is held by a couple of folks within a government system who are advocating for this work. You have a few people within the organization who are working with developers, but what happens when those people leave? And Princess brought up the point of, if this doesn't happen, then what? So what can the city do to really integrate the principles that are in the scorecard into the policies that we make, into the way that we do development reviews, into the requirements that we have? A lot of times developers are coming to the city looking for city subsidy or other public subsidies that are coming to support the development. What requirements can go in place that the developer has to fulfill in order to be able to get public subsidy? I can offer a brief example. One small step that we have made in the LCA program is integrating the principles that are in the livability scorecard into the way that we score applications. So all projects that come through review to get our grant funding are being reviewed on principles that are in the scorecard. And we have a minimum equity score that's going in this year that if projects don't meet that minimum score, regardless of how well they score on other components, will not be moving forward to be considered for funding. We had realized that we had some projects that were coming forward that were doing really great on one area, but we were really concerned about what impact this might have and didn't feel like we were being, we talk a lot about in the government about being good stewards of public funds. We didn't feel like we were being good stewards of public funds if we were going to support projects that we felt like we're going to be leading to displacement. So this is, again, just a small step that we've done just to offer as an example for any government folks on the call of ways that you can start to integrate these principles into the way that you do development review, into the way that you're looking at projects. And this comment came up earlier, I believe Monica brought this up, but always considering who benefits and how. And when you're looking at projects as city staff, when projects are coming in, have the conversation about who benefits and how. And in bringing together community members, community organizations, and developers, have that be central in the conversation that you're having with different stakeholders of who is benefiting and how, and have that kind of drive the policies that you're making going forward.
Thank you so much, Hannah, Gary, and thank you, Monica. Thank you, Yardi, Princess, Kristen. Going forward, we want to hear your thoughts. Excuse me, I'm timing things. We want to hear your thoughts and your experiences. Have some dialogue with you. We want to hear what has this discussion brought up for you? So we have about like 10 minutes. How is your work aligned? What are we missing that needs to be part of this conversation about livability and making tools like the scorecard an avenue to community power? So with that, please raise your digital hand or type stack in the chat to come off mute and share your thoughts and experiences, please. I think if we're respectful, it would be totally fine to just unmute and to speak your mind.
Yeah, this is Mari, kind of going off of my question from the chat on procedural equity and echoing some of what Hannah was just mentioning about preventing displacement. I'm curious if anybody has updates on that wilder development. I didn't hear, like I heard a little bit about it, but I don't know any of the details. And so if anybody has been a part of that or other recent like case studies that have happened and lessons learned, I think would be helpful in a space like this.
Or just quickly to your point, I think that having a little bit of interaction and work on the Aladdis site that you were mentioning, I think it's such a key example of that accountability piece and not having the mechanisms in place as community or as the city ostensibly saying it doesn't have the ability to move the developer in a direction that the community is clearly explicitly asking. So I think I don't have an update on that front. That obviously went to, a mayoral veto and some legal stuff there. But I think that was just such a clear example of not honoring the history, power, and wellness of the community, not honoring the history of the destruction of Rondo, not honoring the power of the community organizing behind what they wanted to see there, and obviously the wellness and not looking to the wellness of the folks in the area. Yes, and Juhi is saying that also an example of how the scorecard can be co-opted by developers as kind of a checklist to use against community in some cases. And also potentially even trying to withdraw applications for public funding because they don't want that mantle of having to be accountable to the community. Yeah, I can I can check in and maybe add a note on where that is in the recap that I send out to everyone, just in the email portion, because it looks like David has questions too.
I have a question I'd like to put out there. So I work with one of the area agencies on aging, and I'm wondering if the scorecard has been used in regard to affordable, equitable housing for older adults, or if that has been part of the conversation.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we were able, I think the most successful use that we've had with the scorecard as far as a deep affordability is with the senior housing project. And that's the one time that we were actually able to influence the RFQ process as well. And so our local CDC in our area, partnering with us through the scorecard, we're able to have reach for senior. It's an entire senior affordable housing complex that is in the process of being built, and it's reaching seniors that are on like the Medicare, Medicaid income level, and so it's deeply affordable and it's all senior, and that has been probably the most successful implementation of our scorecard, even being able to form that RFP process. So that's just one example where we've been able to do that in partnership with the local CDC.
That's great. Monica, can you put your contact info in the chat so I can reach out to you?
Certainly.
There was actually an interesting question earlier up that I don't know if would be generative, but kind of this notion of like, what's the definition of community? Because in some spaces, community might be a whole bunch of white homeowners. If you're thinking about like geographic community. And so how do you grapple with that? And then in some cases, there have been folks who have been dispossessed of that land for, generations ago. And how do we kind of define and work with community in ways that are most equitable? So I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that.
I can give like a pretty brief answer. Something that I've heard a lot working in nonprofit spaces is the co-option of the word community. But then later on, what I've realized is like it's really good to define what community means whenever the project starts, so that everyone is on the same page and use. I think it's good to have a written word of what community means, so that there's some guiding principles around how we interact with each other, and then also keep everyone accountable. Like, this is what we have agreed to, what community is and what community means. Like I said earlier, I think nobody has the power that is outside of the community to bring community care to the community, because community care lives within the community. But again, it looks very different to everyone. So I worked with affordable housing communities, for instance, and when we were writing grants for the work that I was doing beforehand, we would say stuff like, working with the affordable housing community of Riverside Plaza. I don't know what that means. There is so many types of communities within that, or like plaza. There's so many types of community that have different pods and cultural backgrounds that have very different set of values. So I think it's really good to have like the same definition going into a project.
Thank
I'd
you.
like to echo. Sorry, I'd just like to echo some of what you already just said, and maybe expand on that just a little bit. This idea of like weaponizing the term livability came up, and I think without defining community engagement can then also be weaponized to keep marginalized community out. If you are doing community engagement in a specific area, and let's say a very white wealthy area, you can end up amplifying voices that already have a lot of power and keeping people out by not engaging folks who might be new to that community. You see that a lot with affordable housing. And I think that's another way that we need to be kind of careful about how we talk about community. And like Yordi was saying, making sure that we're identifying what community means, so that we're not continuing the same practices that we've been doing, but using the right words, using the language that's in the scorecard, but continuing to do the same things that we've always been doing.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'm sorry to cut you off there. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we have about 15 minutes left. This has been a really powerful session. So in terms of final thoughts for each panelist, what's most resonating for you from this conversation? What's one question you'd urge folks to consider as they leave this space today to take the accountable steps in their roles to advance equitable development and livability? If anyone would like to chime in from the panel.
I think something that resonated the most, there were a lot of things that resonated, but specifically the element of time with development, that is something that comes up a lot in a lot of conversations, specifically with community engagement. And I think Monica put it really well. I can't really re-articulate it, but community engagement and community outreach takes time. And then also simultaneously, deepening relationship with community, building trust with community takes a long time too. And with development, there is a timeline that developers put on the table. And so those two things typically do not match up. So one of them has to be dismissed, or at least have to be compromised in some way. And typically the thing that is usually compromised is the community engagement, and when community comes into the picture. And that is why we keep having really ineffective community engagement and development projects, because we're not giving community to soak in what is coming to the community, and then also what is the outcomes of the project. That takes a lot of time, especially in overburdened communities. So, the element of time came up for me.
I would say when thinking about all of the things that we've talked about in the past hour, I circle back to the power structure of what this is, right? It is a white supremacist system of power, access to money and land, and who has it and who doesn't, and who has access to build the wealth. And I deeply believe in the methodology of organizing internally and externally in the community and in the grass tops and in the grassroots. And so I think weighing the risk against the fear and what is the cost of not being bold or not being courageous. When I think about the spaces where the question came up in the chat about the layers of bureaucracy or the layers of process in equity, that's very true. And so it requires a level of organizing that is both internal and external, but without the risk and without calling out what the white supremacist power structure is and how that's embedded in the systems that we're trying to shift and change at a greater scale. It was intentional. It is intentional that it is cumbersome, that it is complicated, that it is not familiar to community to navigate these processes. That is an intentional setting. And if we want to shift the dynamics, we have to shift that too. So I will go back to saying it's about power and money, who has it, who doesn't, and who has access to it, and how bold we want to be to shift that.
I've been thinking a lot about accountability during this conversation and how easy it is for a lot of folks in institutions that are like the gatekeepers to development to deflect accountability and again to kind of use the right words, say the right things, present in a way that makes it look like you are on board and involving community, but without really changing anything, and kind of what it will take to truly have accountability. And I think, Kai, you had asked if there is a question that we wanted to leave with folks, and for any government folks that are on the call, the question that I would leave to you is to think about like the immense amount of power that you do have as someone in government involved in approving development, involved in typically being one of the first contacts for developers when new projects are started, and thinking about what you can do to give up some of that power. Think about what you can do to change the systems that you work in, and share the power that you have, and start to see a shift beyond just like using the scorecard on a project by project basis to start to shift some of those institutions.
The part that's standing out to me is we get to hold them accountable. I know I brought up this issue about accountability and laws, like to get government behind us to say, to get the system to agree that it needs to change, but the system was set up to be that way. So it's working on its behalf. And then I'm just left feeling powerful, whether they give it to me or not, because we hold them accountable and we do show up in droves. It is a challenge when you are the community that you're fighting for and you're trying to eat and you're traumatized and you don't have housing and you're disproportionately affected every time you turn around. And then you have to learn this idea behind community organizing and this language of development. And there's no degree or an increase in pay for your investment into the personal liberation of yourself and the liberation of people who are impacted by the same things, which aren't always just people of color. It's just humans, the being. And so I'm leaving feeling with the idea that for now, we hold them accountable until we get the system to say, hey, it's impacting everybody. And there's a few books I'm reading. I'm healing a traumatic brain injury, but I think it's the sum of us, how this impacts everyone, for not just people of color or people who you might not see as your community. When you talked about like, what does community mean? And I thank you for the opportunity to sit on this panel every time I'm in the room with the community organizers such as this team. I'm always learning. So that's what I'm leaving with, and thank you for listening.
So, okay. I would like to, I believe we're ready for this, pass the mic, so to speak, back to Juhi from Executive Director of the Alliance.
Thanks, Kai. Thanks, everybody. This was just a fantastic conversation. And you can just imagine what the conversations over the last year in building this principle have been among the partners. It's so powerful and learning so much. And I really hope and encourage everybody who is here today to try to have these conversations in your workplace and your communities about livability as well. But that said, there's another opportunity to do this that the Alliance is bringing together. So we actually have a scorecard enthusiast table. That's what we call ourselves, of people who are interested in the scorecard or users of the scorecard. And it's a community of practice kind of shared learning table around it, because it's a tool that is relatively new still. And so people are still figuring out, how do we best use it? How do we best leverage it? What are other people doing? And people are very curious about that. So this is what the table is for. And so Carolyn put into the chat, we actually have a meeting coming up the next Wednesday of the enthusiast table. It's open to anybody. It's a Zoom meeting. And we'll be talking about the livability principle again, as well as we have a group from Detroit who has been using the scorecard, or are planning to use the scorecard on a project in Detroit as well. So this work is, nationwide. We haven't had somebody from Canada interested, so we could say international. And I really hope that you guys join us with that. Use the tool, and I'm always curious about how people are doing it. So reach out to me if you have any questions, or just want to share your work with somebody. So thanks. Back to Kai.
Hello there. Again, my name is Kai Andersen. I work at Nexus Community Partners on the North Star Black Economic Cooperative and Housing Cooperatives. And I just want to say thank you to everyone: Carolyn, Juhi, Alliance, Hannah, Yordi, Princess, Kristen, Monica, and everyone. Have a beautiful day, and please continue these discussions. And I'm sending positive vibes and good energy to all of you.